third day in a row. Same clothes, same faces, familiar places, grinding, shooting, episode after episode. We haven't moved, haven't eaten, and have somehow made the energy drinks that I had here disappear. Ladies and gentlemen, it's episode 3 of the Muscle and Feels podcast. Ow! With our usual sponsor. Okay, there's a light on the Wolfpack bag, so I will ignore that. I am one of your hosts, the bolder but also handsomer Patroclus Pack, Andrew Likes aka Pack. And on my left, I have
the illustrious, the one and only Milo Wolf, who cut off his co-host.
Indeed. Mr. Rom, Mr. Romantic. That was shit. They already did the Rome wasn't built in a day punchline on that paper.
Indeed.
Yes.
Not all ROMs lead to Rome, actually.
That's all I had to say. What do you think about that paper?
I've looked at it once, and my takeaway was, this is interesting, but it's also something I've thought before.
Wow.
Indeed.
Indeed.
Shots fired.
So, last episode we looked at your PhD, your pretty huge dick.
PhD.
You talked about your studies, the one that you have completed, aka the literature review, and some of the preliminary findings from your interview and survey study, as well as what you're planning to do for your intervention study, and some takeaways. And now it's time to dive, to embark on the journey that is minimum effective training dose, aka my PhD.
Indeed. So let's start off the same way. How did you find the idea to do your PhD in the first place, and specifically on the minimum dose TM?
Trademark, indeed. So I originally I finished my bachelor's and I enjoyed the research side of things. I enjoyed the research side of things not as a prospective career, but rather as somebody who is relatively curious and likes to search for stuff and has always been a fan of, okay, let's Google this, let's Google that, let's get to the bottom of... I used to like, and I still like, computers, so I was used to searching for stuff a lot because I was self-taught. Anyways, after doing my dissertation, I told my soon-to-be back then PhD supervisor, Associate Professor Dr. James Steele, aka James. I told him, hey James, now that I finished the dissertation, he was my dissertation supervisor as well. I enjoyed the whole research schmick. How about I do some research at the uni, help out, or come up with a couple of projects? And we came up with a project investigating the lumbar extension strength of powerlifters versus recreationally active lifters, essentially using a machine that restricts your pelvis, isolate your lower back, and we measured strength on powerlifters versus people that just did Romanian deadlifts recreationally. That's published, link in bio. And as time passed, I got to help on some other research projects, and then so the setup that I live in the UK, but I go back to Greece often, and when I was going back to Greece, we had a training facility, an Olympic weightlifting hall, a quite famous one where some of the best Greek weightlifters have trained at, and we had access to that and access to a powerlifting team that worked out there, as well as a coach who was a personal friend, and that's where I worked at too whenever I visited Greece. So at that training facility, we had access to quite the unique setup in terms of collecting data and doing potentially a pilot study or a short-term study, because we had a coach, a bunch of powerlifters at the same place, and because they were being coached for free and they had access to that room for free, there was a chance for them to be happy to participate to some research. And with that coach back then, as a fellow strength geek, we were like, cool, what would be a nice study to do? And we thought, all right, let's just test what's the least one needs to do, or what's the effect, what effect does a very, very, very low volume program have on powerlifting strength for powerlifters who were preparing for competition. So we took 10 powerlifters. I think the team was like 12 or 15 people, 10 people that were willing to participate, split them into 2 groups, 5 and 5. So a very small sample for each group. It's very small sample size overall. And just overall an exploratory pilot study. and had one group in preparation for the powerlifting competition do just singles, just one single per lift per week, times three. Times 3 for the bench, times 2 for the squat, times 1 for the deadlift. Training 3 times a week, doing singles on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So it was squat, bench, then Wednesday deadlift, bench, and then Friday squat, bench again. Just one single at RP 9 to 9.5. So a very heavy single, but that was that. They did nothing else, no accessories. And then the other group did traditional sort of higher volume powerlifting training. They did higher volume, then volume went down, load went up. They did a very typical, like, standardized peak protocol, and they were all tested in competition. And the results of that study were mixed. So some of the people that were doing the singles had hit all-time total and total PRs during training. So that the whole training intervention was 10 weeks. Around the 5 to 7 week mark, they hit all-time PRs. But in comp, I think only 2 out of 5 people improved their total. One didn't improve, 2 lost strength. And from the other group, we had 2 dropouts. So just 3 people completing the study.
Yeah.
2 increased their strength. 1 just kept his strength the same. Obviously, the fact that they were tested in competition was a limitation on its own because as one knows, gym lifts or whatever, lab lifts or test days in a familiar environment, the circumstances are much different than if you were to be competing at a national level competition like they were. So that was a limitation. Anyways, the whole point of the study was for it to be a pilot study, see what happens. The results were somewhat interesting because we saw that with such low volumes, maybe there's something there.
Yeah, I mean, briefly, I guess, while that is a limitation, it's also a strength in that it's more ecologically valid.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing with research oftentimes is that, what you're doing on your isokinetic dynamometer in the lab and seeing better growth out of better strength gains might not necessarily translate to how it happens in the gym with different exercises, different environments, and so forth. Whereas in this case, you literally went and measured the thing people care about, people being powerlifters.
For sure, but my counter argument there is why don't you just buy a dynamometer
And train with that exclusively. That's a good point.
It's motivation, if anything. So for all you losers out there who can't afford all the lab equipment a sports science lab of a major university has, get your grind on.
Just be better.
This is a major warning to all of you.
Major key
alert. God did. Milo did. So, yeah, we did that study. I was like, I didn't know what to expect. At the time, though, my PhD actually wasn't the minimum dose. My PhD was something as generic. So with James, we said, okay, let's come up with a general idea and we'll narrow it down by searching more and more and more. The first idea was factors, like anthropometric factors contributing to powerlifting performance. So I did my literature search. I wrote a first sort of systematic review draft. And when we did that study, I was like, when trying to conceptualize the whole factors affecting powerlifting performance, I was like, there's so many things that one would need to look at. The anthropometry side of things was not that interesting to me, and as somebody who's doing a self-funded PhD, I did not want to go down the path of picking a topic that 3, 4, 5 years down the line I have to know everything about. And yeah, maybe it's interesting enough at the beginning, but unless, as Eric Helms has said, if your PhD at the beginning of your PhD is not fucking extreme, I love it, by the end of the PhD you're going to be a bit like, So it was important to me that I really enjoyed what I was researching.
What if you started like that anyways? What if your default mode is...
I mean, depends on the character. You may still complete it. I think there's plenty of PhDs out there that have finished. But, when you got into your PhD, what was your sort of default idea?
I meant without PhD, even just in general. Your personality is just,
Yeah, that's what I mean. You've heard a lot of horror stories from.
Indeed, yeah.
So when I got into the PhD and having had a mother who completed her PhD over a decade, and because back then computers weren't like, you had physical paper there, so I would see the stacks of paper and my idea of a PhD. And she had an issue with her Viva, and then she had to redo it. And my idea of a PhD was, okay, yeah, this is gonna be hell.
The days before Skynet took over and powerlifting competitions became legit.
The good days, man. Make powerlifting great again. Skynet abolished the human element of every human element of powerlifting. Just robots lifting. Make it like a forklift competition. Think how cool that would be.
That would be pretty cool.
Overweight guy, cigarette in his mouth, rolling up.
Indeed.
Right, man. 1,000-pound deadlift. 4
Basically
reps.
epic esports, but actually good esports. You know?
Esports better than powerlifting, of course, than most sports.
Indeed.
Come at me. Don't hate me. Don't hate the facts. So we do that study, and I'm like, this is quite interesting. I'm sure somebody has looked at what's the least one can do and still get stronger. Okay. Couldn't find anything. Couldn't find much. Obviously, there's studies on single sets versus multiple sets. But like nobody had really looked at the concept of what's the least that you need to do in order to get meaningfully stronger. Which obviously is not, it wasn't me thinking, okay, I don't like training. What's the least I could do or my clients could do and still get stronger? But
You're being lazy.
yeah, exactly. It was a PhD at being lazy, essentially. But in all seriousness, it was a concept that I found interesting, especially as somebody who is the opposite of that when it comes to my training. I like being in the gym for quite some time. And yeah, so that was what gave birth to the project. So then the approach was systematic review and meta-analysis, much like you. I did the same thing. Went away, looked at the literature. My inclusion criteria was trained individuals. Because I was looking at the minimum effective training dose for powerlifting specifically. So we went even nicher, if that's a word. The inclusion criteria for the systematic review was studies that needed to be randomized controlled trials. So I'm not sure why we did that, but we excluded my study, the one study on the topic that had been published at the time.
Well done.
Played myself. 4D chess.
Got science
Play
points
yourself.
for only including RCTs though.
God did. And yeah. So inclusion criteria, resistance trained individuals, squat, bench, or deadlift as tested via 1 repetition maximum strength pre and post, and maximum 1 set per power lift, so per squat or per bench press per session, per training session. Essentially what came out of that study, and I redid the analysis a few months ago, the search, and I did it a year ago for my Viva as well, and I couldn't find much more. Maybe there's another study or two out there that would fit that criteria that could be added. But we found that the six studies that made it into the systematic review, that with 2 to 3 sets per lift per week at 6 to 12 repetitions at 75 to 85% 1RM approximately, performed close or to muscular failure, were enough for one to increase 1RM strength in the bench and the squat significantly defined as statistical significance. There was no data on the deadlift without the inclusion criteria specified, no data on women, and aside from our pilot study, which must also be interpreted with extreme caution, there was no data on powerlifters, of course. So after that, the plan was this. Initially, like you, the plan was do a bunch of intervention studies. But when I reached my transfer, so the transfer here in the UK is midway your PhD, especially if you're doing a Master of Philosophy with the option to transfer to a PhD. It's like a mid-PhD exam where you sit down with some internal examiners and they look at your work thus far and say, okay, yep, blah, blah, blah. You have an oral examination and they decide whether your project is worthy of making it to the PhD level, to advancing to being worthy of being a PhD, essentially, and being a novel contribution to knowledge. So we reached that stage, and that was something that really helped the PhD as a project, because the original plan was to do a bunch of intervention studies with just powerlifters doing different low volume, sort of daily max auto-regulated protocols, and and see how they compare. But obviously, powerlifters as a population, recruiting them for training interventions is one, hard, and two, even though we were lucky enough to receive a very generous donation from Renaissance Periodization, shout out Renaissance Periodization, to assist in data collection, even though it's still very hard to get powerlifters to stick to your training, especially an unorthodox sort of training like the minimum dose, especially when there's no data out there to show, hey, this may be solid. And at the same time, the small sample sizes that would result from that limitation, so powerlifters being a difficult population to recruit, would not really allow for the PhD to hold its weight, just because you have, 4 intervention studies with low volume training protocols, maybe 10, 12 people each study, if that, by itself, and 6 weeks for each study. Who says that it's the protocols themselves, the nature of the protocol, so low rep, very specific, high load. It could be that you're just testing the effect of different protocols rather than exploring the concept as a whole. So when that Viva happened, the comments by the examiners, which were along those lines, were very useful. And the fact that Bovit happened at that time as well, inspired me to also do an interview and survey study along with some training intervention studies. So this is what the PhD looked like after. Systematic review done. Then 2 intervention studies, one having people do singles like the first study, one other group doing the exact same protocol, plus 2 sets of 3 reps at 80% of whatever they hit for the single. So essentially 2 triples as back-off sets. Training intervention study 2, because we have, systematic review, pilot study, training intervention 1. Training intervention 2 was the group with the back-off reps, so another group exactly like that, and a group taking 70% of their pre-tested 1RM for an AMRAP on every session. Same training frequency, 2-3-1 on squat, bench, and deadlift, so twice a week for squat, 3 for bench, 1 for deadlift. Those were the intervention studies. And then we had a survey study, which essentially asked powerlifters and powerlifting coaches what do they regard as a meaningful strength change over 6 weeks, so we can then use that input to better analyze the data from our training studies, because using inferential statistics with such low samples could be problematic. So, and at the same time, approaching the data analysis in that way could, one could argue that it's more appropriate for powerlifters and coaches as well, because me telling you, hey, statistically significant strength increase, a powerlifter will say, all right, but is this something that in competition or in training is meaningful for me as a powerlifter? We also double-checked whatever the coaches and athletes said with the openpowerlifting.org database, essentially looked at what's needed for a powerlifter to go up and by one place in ranking. We looked at IPF specifically. All that can be found. The specifics can be found. Link in bio. The study is... what's the word?
Link in description?
No, it's not open source. I'm blanking out.
It's open access.
Open access, there we go. The computer geek in me thought it was open source. It's open source too.
Technically, it's the same thing, I guess.
Same thing. So that survey study, and then one interview study with very experienced powerlifters and coaches, including some all-time world record holders in powerlifting that are the records still stand, and coaches that had coached multiple IPF world champions, multiple world record holders, essentially 28 powerlifters and elite athletes that were extremely experienced. One, to cover that part of the population, because you have the typical, yeah, man, but they were college-age students. That doesn't apply to me because I am slightly stronger. So, one, we asked the freaks, but like serious freaks, and the coaches that have worked with thousands of people, from freaks to average Joe who just wants to get stronger. And last but not least, a survey with IPF national or international competitors, where we asked them, hey, have you played around with a concept, and how did you find the minimum dose if you did experiment with it, and a bunch of details. So essentially, systematic review, pilot, training intervention, second training intervention, survey, interview, survey. A bunch of studies. and the chance for us to triangulate the results from the interviews with the interventions and the surveys and see, okay, do the coaches that have worked with so many people and the athletes that are, top of their field, does their opinion sort of agree or back up the training intervention data? Now, in terms of the result, the group that did just the singles had 6% of achieving greater increases than the coaches. Let me fidget spin while I say it. Than the coaches and the athletes regarded as meaningful, and around 13% chance to be within what they regarded as meaningful. The group that did the AMRAPs, that group was cut short due to a certain virus that was going wild at the time. So we had the third training intervention study was cut short. So pilot training intervention 1, training intervention 2 was cut short due to COVID. So we ended up recruiting only 9 people. The second intervention study had 16 powerlifters, 8 per group, and then it was 4 and 5. And the group that did the AMRAPs, so a relatively unorthodox protocol for powerlifters, like essentially doing sets of 12 to 20 reps, they had a 44% chance of achieving total increases greater than what the powerlifting coaches and the athletes regarded as meaningful. Obviously, huge caution when interpreting the results of those studies, because just a few people, 6 weeks, heavy singles, heavy-ish back-off sets. Overall, one could say, hey, maybe they just peaked. Maybe their strength, maybe if they weren't very experienced with singles before or for some time, just doing singles potentiated their strength. That said, though, the results were encouraging in the form that, hey, if one has a few weeks where they can't train a lot, they could probably at least maintain or slightly increase their strength if we're being super safe about it. But the results of the study showed that they may be able to even significantly increase their strength. Some other interesting findings: barely any soreness in any of the groups, which was also cool. Let's say you're super busy and your recovery resources are somewhat limited in terms of sleep and maybe calories. The fact that soreness was very low was also cool. Enjoyment was also relatively high, but more details, check out the full text of the paper. Moving on to the study where we interviewed the athletes and coaches, which I found to be extremely cool, both in terms of data collection, and I think it really added value to the project. Similarly to Milo's PhD, a mixed methods approach, especially in areas that are very limited in terms of current available evidence, being able to, and whenever you're investigating a concept, asking expert opinion can really help sort of lay that foundation, which was the point of the PhD. The point of the PhD was not to answer how many sets per week do I need, but rather lay the foundation for the concept of the minimum dose. The coaches and athletes, just again, summarizing some of what we found, they said around a few heavy, high intensity of effort sets per week, around 1 to 5 repetitions will probably be enough. One can try and implement minimum dose training when they are busy, when preparing for competition, as well as, actually when time is limited, so those two. We did ask a bunch of questions around the concept overall, whether they think it's useful, and a few more specific questions around how they plan it. But the consensus was a few heavy sets per week, 1 to 5 reps, you should be good to go. So now I'm just mentioning stuff that I remember from the interviews. Some all-time world record holders specifically mentioned that they were surprised with how low they could push their training volume, and that they actually needed much less at certain times to progress than they believed. That's obviously not to say do less when you can potentially get more out of doing more. Now, last but not least, we had the survey study that we asked powerlifters, hey, have you implemented a minimum training dose approach? And if you have, what do you do? I'm not going to go into what they do part. That's interesting. You can have a look at it on the full text. It is similar, well, to a certain extent, a few heavy sets, a few back-off sets, and specifics on RPE, number of reps, and so on and so forth. But what I found interesting was that the majority of participants that completed the survey, so around 50-something, I don't remember 55, they said they hadn't experimented with a minimum dose training approach, but 98% of those who hadn't experimented with it said they would be happy to experiment with such an approach if more evidence was to come out and support it. Because a powerlifter who is a powerlifter as their hobby, the last thing that he or she wants to do is randomly experiment with their training to that extent, to doing just a few singles per week and risking losing valuable progress and time. So in total, the PhD sort of found that the minimum dose for strength may be, it's a concept that one can play around with, and there's utility to it if you are busy, if your recovery is impacted by exogenous factors. But a few heavy, close to failure, high intensity of effort sets per week per power lift may be enough to significantly or meaningfully increase your strength over 6 to 12 weeks. That's another thing the coaches said. They said somewhere around 6 to 12 weeks, they think, coaches and athletes, they think such an approach would be useful. So, really cool overall. More research is needed. And I've made a little training template on Google Sheets, which is free, also in the description. If anybody wants to play around with some of the protocols whenever they're busy or whenever they want to try a minimum dose approach, give it a go. It's not a method, it's a concept. It's not the exact number of sets and reps we did in the studies is one thing. You could play around with it whichever way you want. Maybe for a specific lift, you can combine it with hypertrophy training, but we'll get to that in a second.
First of all, amazing PhD, honestly. Very well-rounded project, and I feel like it combined different methods to very good ends. So, for example, the study with interviews and surveys to determine what was deemed meaningful for coaches and athletes in powerlifting really helped with the interpretation of the studies. And the analysis was really well done as well. So shout out James Steele once more.
Dr. James Steele for coming on.
Associate Professor James Steele.
Associate Professor. I apologize, James, for the disrespect.
My second dad.
Yeah. Mine too. And yeah, his input in the analysis was crucial. The idea of going about it, doing the whole expert opinion approach, game changer and appropriate, because sure, we could have run inferential statistics and told you, yep, group A saw a statistically significant increase in their total, which I think they would have. But would it be super appropriate given the extremely low samples? Probably not.
I think two really cool things about the analysis specifically is one, the probability approach.
The graphs.
Well, the graphs are very cool too, but the probability approach is very cool because to the layman, right, average powerlifter reading the paper, it gives them a really good idea of what to expect and what sort of effect sizes we're talking about, but in more intuitive terms. And then secondly, the second thing I really liked was that instead of using effect sizes like Hedges G or Cohen's D, you used the actual...
James's D.
Indeed. You used the actual measurement unit, which was kilograms on the lift or on the total.
Yeah, that was
which
really
again,
cool.
Really intuitive and really good for people reading the paper.
To be honest with you, though, and as we said on the previous episode, which was recorded many months ago and not an hour ago, we also published those two training interventions, survey to inform those, survey and interview studies, so 5 studies in one paper, like Milo will be doing as well. And that idea was also really cool. But to be honest with you, I think in terms of clout, the paper got its fair share of attention, and that was great. But I think that people would have paid a bit more attention to some of the findings if they were presented in the traditional way. If they were presented if we had run inferential statistics and reported, because we did report total increase, like kilos and stuff, but you have to kind of look at it's not highlighted as much. We didn't say, hey, they gained 30 kilos on their total, because one group did. Obviously, there were some outliers and some terms and conditions there. But if we had done that and a little asterisk and a p-value, I think some people would have been like, oh, wow, 30 kilos.
Taking notice more so. Maybe.
Taking notice more of the results. The whole project, as a project, got a lot of, was noticed. But those specific studies, I think the probabilistic approach for some people, it was a bit like, oh, okay, waves, one wave is closer.
Who's doing the fake study?
Huh?
Who's doing the fake science again?
Indeed.
Shout out Barbralo et al. 2020.
2022 and 23.
Indeed.
But
So one question I actually had was, recruiting powerlifters for a training study is definitely not easy, right? Because they've got their own training. They don't want to change from it. They usually want the best results. And so recruiting powerlifters must not have been easy. How did you go about getting those people into your study? Because that's something a lot of studies could use help with, is getting people that are actually a target demographic. So
yeah, I mean, to be honest, we managed to recruit a total of 32 lifters over 2.5 years with very generous donation. RP, shout out. So, yes, we did recruit powerlifters, but it was my PhD project. I am somebody who locally here, I have, many friends that participate in that powerlift, and I coach. And at the time, I had a lifter who was doing really well at nationals here, and he broke a couple of records, and that allowed me to sort of be a bit more, for people to be a bit more open to, oh, okay, he's the guy that trains that guy at the gym, and be happy to participate. And you know what was really interesting? It was that I had a few people that, even though I said, hey, we're offering, obviously, we're offering to pay for your gym membership, and
so I guess that's worth mentioning. One financial incentive was that you were paying for people's gym membership. Is that right?
yeah, for the duration of the study and a bit more. But there were a few people that said, I don't care about the incentive. I don't want it. I want to just help, which was great. But overall, it's a bit of a placebo that we did extremely well with recruitment.
I mean, running a study in powerlifters isn't easy, and you got 32 people, which, sure, it was
Yeah.
over 2.5 years total,
Sure.
but still, it makes for a good study and a much more ecologically valid study than most studies can claim to be.
The one thing was the multi-site data collection that also helped, and the fact that we didn't do the training sessions in the lab, but rather in gyms.
Could you clarify?
So we collect the data here in Southampton, but also, here in the UK, but also in Greece, at another facility, at another gym. Because this was a collaborative project in terms of the data collection, there were a few other researchers involved, and that really helped to a certain extent. But overall, I guess the main takeaway, to answer your question, the main thing that helped was having a network of people that I knew before that were happy to participate, keeping the studies relatively short and as attractive as possible, in the sense that, the protocols were unorthodox, but at the same time, heavy singles, max out. And we had the pilot study as well that was done before. Actually, I'm mostly referring to the two training intervention studies done after the pilot, because the pilot, I cannot tell people, go find yourself actually, you could. Another thing you could be, reach out to a powerlifting team, and that's what we did for the first study. We said, cool, we have a bunch of people here, would they be up to participate in the study? And that's what happened. But I guess having a solid network of individuals that would be happy to help, and just asking sometimes goes much further away than one might assume. So building a network with coaches, athletes, and at the same time having a study design that is answering your question, but will also be somewhat attractive to some lifters. That said, though, I also think that most people do not. It's difficult to recruit powerlifters, sure, but also how many people out there that are not doing their PhD specifically in powerlifting are doing research in powerlifting for the sake of doing research in powerlifting. So that's another point. Sure, they're a hard population to recruit, but if there was money and research for powerlifting, I'm sure people would be able to reach out to teams, reach out to GB powerlifting, and say, hey guys, money for a training study.
Big powerlifting's back at it again.
Indeed.
Funding all these studies.
But if you're you or me now, after the PhD is done, and I want to look at 1RM strength or like muscle strength or hypertrophy, I'd much rather recruit a population that will be happy to follow something longer term, is not necessarily spending a ton of money and time investing in their hobby sport. So I think powerlifters are not being approached as much, because people would much rather avoid any sort of barriers to recruiting them.
And they're also smelly.
They also smell. Have you ever smelled somebody's knee sleeves?
Or elbow sleeves. I've heard one of the hosts has very smelly elbow sleeves.
It's the sleeves, though. Like, I barely wear
I'm
them.
sure it is, pal.
Elbow sleeves, the new overhead press assistant.
If you can squat with knee sleeves, surely you should be able to.
Squat with
Overhead
knee
press.
sleeves, with elbow sleeves.
Indeed. Or overhead press with knee sleeves.
Yeah.
Why not 2 pairs?
Or wraps. That's the best. The elbow wraps gets me
Indeed.
every time. So, overall, yeah, my tips for data collection. I think many people disregard the networking, the positive effect that networking can have. But again, even with the networking and the financial incentive, 32 people, great. But it was 2.5 years of me doing just that.
Sure.
And also being blessed enough to have a job that allowed me to work from home. So I think that was key as well, because I wasn't stuck. I wasn't supposed. I didn't have to be somewhere every day from, I don't know, 9 to 5 or whatever. And the whole setup, because it was a self-funded PhD, I wasn't getting paid for the PhD, and I needed to still have a job like most self-funded PhDs. The setup was relatively friendly, but yeah.
Nice. I guess I've got 2 more questions for you. The first would be, in practice, how did you actually apply some of these ideas to your own training and your clients' training?
Sure. I mean, my own training, I don't really train for strength at the moment. I mean, I train, actually, I'm chatting shit. I generally don't train for strength, but I train my deadlift for strength at the moment. So I applied the minimum dose sort of placebo approach to my deadlift. So I'm doing mostly hypertrophy training.
As you can tell.
And I still want my deadlift to go up, but I don't care about optimizing my strength development in the deadlift. So what I do is I do a few singles and back offs per week for the deadlift, sometimes even as low as a single and 1 back off set. And deadlift has been slowly moving up, but I am still training, doing RDLs, back, lower back, hamstring work outside of the deadlift. With clients, honestly, I work with people from all sorts of professional and sporting backgrounds, and I do have some people, shout out to them, you know who you are, much love, that have insane work schedules. I'm talking about, 50 to 60 hours per week, sometimes even more. Well, even more, maybe a bit hyperbolic, the one YOLO week, but very high demanding jobs, families, but at the same time, they want to still make progress and at least not regress. And that's where somewhere where minimum dose training was really, really cool to see, to implement. And I also found it interesting that once the project came out, a few people reached out and said, hey, I've actually been playing around with, or I played around with the concept. I played around with lower volume training, did well. For example, a friend the other day from Greece, who's a medical doctor, shout out, Ilias Katsinaris, you know who you are, because I just said your name. He had, in Greece, everybody has to go to the Greek army, so Greek army is mandatory, unless you live abroad, like this guy, for many years. And he had to go to the army, because if you don't go to the army, even if you get an exemption because you have some sort of a mental health reason to not go to, if you want to work in the public sector, that creates a bit of a barrier. Yeah. Anyways, he had to go to the army. He's somebody who trains hard, power lifts, strength trains, and he had to be inside the army for most days of the week, but he had a few hours outside the camp. There's no, obviously, the gyms in the Greek army are Rocky montage sort of fucking
Setup.
Yeah, full on. So the few hours he had outside the gym, he went to outside the army. He went to a gym, hit a few singles, managed to hit a couple of mini PRs, or at least not regress and make some progress on his lifts. So for my clients, during really busy periods or periods of high fatigue, or even after high volume phases, when things are getting hectic in their life, even if they still have time, if I see that everything else is sort of ramping up, making training super simple and keeping it, keeping it as simple as go in, hit a few hard sets, go out. From a psychological point of view as well, I've noticed, anecdotally, citation right here, that it allows them to make progress.
Nice. Great answer.
But I've had a few clients reach out, and they're like, so they've applied for coaching, and I've reached out, and I've said, I've done my PhD on this and that, and they're like, oh yeah, is minimum dose training going to work for my goal? And I'm like, no, it's you're not getting a minimum dose program if your
Wait,
goal
they're not?
No.
I want my money back now.
Like, you're not gonna I'm not gonna say, yeah, you're gonna do 3 sets a week if your goal is getting as big and as jacked as possible. But
Is there someone out there for the maximum effective dose?
yeah, it's my arch nemesis, Pack.
More handsome, more beard.
No beard, hair. Very well. The
No tattoos. Actually, dark skinned.
yes, because I was gonna say I'm very pale.
Indeed.
And not Greek, but I guess Turkish. Shout out to Turkey. We're
better
coming
have.
to the World Uni Championships in November with Hannah Clayton.
Enough with the tangent. One final question. Dr. Androulakis Korakakis. Was it worth getting a PhD? How did you find it helped you in the end?
Yeah, for sure. So originally the plan, as we mentioned during the intro, I have taught at university, and teaching, lecturing was something I really enjoyed. But although the original plan was to potentially examine whether I'd stay in academia, the reason behind the PhD was I loved the process of it. I was blessed to have a supervisor like James who made the PhD an amazing journey. But it helped with coaching because it adds credibility. Like Joe, even though there are people out there with PhDs and MDs and SMMDs and whatever that are absolute clowns.
Shout out Dr. Seidman.
Yeah, shout out that guy. I don't get it. It adds a bit of credibility when coaching, and overall I can make jokes like I'm a real doctor. Doctors are not doctors, they are physicians, and the same way that I do because of the fact that I got British citizenship. But yeah, jokes, credibility, but mostly it was the journey. I don't want to sound cliche. It helped because I learned a bunch of stuff. I became a better researcher, better academic, and better coach, I guess, out of it. The Viva was an amazing experience at the end. So doing the oral examination at the end with 2 amazing examiners was cool. But I would not... Sorry, I can see you ready. I'd say that if you want to get into academia, it's sort of mandatory to do a PhD. If you don't, then you need to have a setup outside of the PhD and if you really want the PhD for the knowledge, for the cloud, for whatever, you need to have a setup that will allow you to do that without losing your mind.
Agreed. I would say you're sounding quite nostalgic now. It's like you're talking about how back in my day when I did my PhD.
It was a good time, but obviously I'm glad it's done and dusted. But
Indeed.
It was a good time, and it was the exact opposite of all the horror stories I had heard. So going into my Viva, I was like, oh man, they're gonna tear me apart, and it was amazing. It was 5-6 hours of just talking about the PhD, talking about the findings, the limitations, and again, the idea, I really liked how we approached this in an exploratory manner. Hey, this is a base for more research to be done on it, rather than I'm trying to discover the minimum dose, because that would be the wrong approach.
Well done. We just earned our check from Big PhD, so we'll be upgrading the setup effective starting next podcast.
The $5 that we're gonna get from Big PhD.
Big PhD, indeed. They don't have enough money to pay PhD students in the first place, so we're not getting...
They will ask us for money. Sir, you mentioned PhD 4.5 times every minute.
Can you pay us now as well, please?
Pay us, please.
Anyways, enough of your glory tales from back when you did your PhD, Grandpa. It's time for bed.
It is time for bed. We appreciate you for tuning in. 3rd episode. We promise different clothes for the next episode.
Or do we?
Ooh,
Keep 'em guessing.
From the lab studio /office /Milo's thing. Where am I? We're everywhere.
On your favorite streaming platforms.
In court. We'll see you there. Peace.